Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Policy Exchange events room for the Conservative Party conference. My name is Matt Rooney. I'm a research fellow in energy and environment at Policy Exchange, and I'll be chairing this event on driving down emissions, how to clean up road transport, which is a report that Policy Exchange put out earlier in the year that covers all of the strategies you could use to clean up road transport. We're delighted to have on the panel Jesse Norman, MP, who's Minister for Roads and Local Transport, Mike Copson from Shell New Energy, Lianna Etkind from the Campaign for Better Transport, and Hugo Spowers from RiverSimple, who make hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. Before I let the panelists, the event will be 5-minute opening statements from the panelists, followed by as many questions as you like from the audience. But before I go to the panelists, I'll just do a brief introduction. First of all, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Anglo American. We don't want to spank them. We'd also like to thank our events team, who are working very hard at this event, and thank the Conservative Party for hosting us. So the topic of cleaning up road transport came about for Policy Exchange from Richard Howard, who was the head of Energy and Environment, who has since left us. But about a year ago, he came up with the idea for this project based on previous good work he had done on cleaning up air in London. So all across the country, our cities are polluted with particulate matter and nitrogen oxides. And he put out 2 reports on cleaning up our air and reducing pollution. But air quality cannot be separated from carbon dioxide emissions, and they're both related to transport. So if the government does have a strategy for cleaning up air quality, it'll also relate to cleaning up carbon emissions. And there are various strategies you can use for this. So if you wanted to reduce air pollution, you could have some very quick wins in that respect. NOx emissions are primarily a diesel problem, so you could swap diesels for petrol or natural gas vehicles, and you get some quite cheap wins on air quality, but perhaps you're not reducing carbon emissions much. If you want to improve air quality and reduce carbon emissions, then you can move to battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, and you get big wins with both, but it's a bit of a bigger change. You have to have infrastructure changes and things like this. And but some people would say, well, if we really want to make a big impact, we need to get people out of their cars and onto public transport and onto their bicycles and walking. And I'm glad that last week we had somebody from National Grid to talk about electricity system, and this week we have Lianna Etkind from the Campaign for Better Transport, who I'm sure will cover that topic. The one thing that got picked up from a policy point of view from our report that the government should be aware of is if electric vehicles really take off quicker than we thought, there will be a huge fiscal black hole in the government's finances, because the VAT on electricity is only 5%, whereas fuel duty and VAT on petrol and diesel is very, very high and brings in so fuel duty and road taxes bring in over £30 billion a year. And so if we stick to the Committee on Climate Change trajectory for decarbonising transport, then we could be losing more than £10 billion a year in tax receipts, which is something the government has to think very seriously about. I'd like to bring in our panelists now, and I'd like to start with Lianna Etkind, who I'm sure will cover public transport and getting people to cycle more and things like that.
Thank you very much. So our answer to cleaning up our roads, cleaning up our transport in one line is not just better cars and newer cars, but fewer cars. We can't continue with the status quo because in cities across the country, lethal and illegal levels of air pollution are filling people's lungs and limiting lives, with 80% of NOx in urban areas coming from diesel emissions. And CO2 emissions are already off track against our climate change commitments. Pretty much every other sector, whether it's manufacturing or whether it's energy, has made pretty good progress in reducing carbon emissions, but transport is that sector where much more needs to be done. Not only to decarbonise the fleet with all the exciting technologies which are available now, but also to cut car miles and the UK Commission on Climate Change estimates that we need to cut car miles by 5% beyond the current baseline to have a chance of meeting our commitments. And that means providing real alternatives to car dependency, so people have transport options, and incentivising people and organisations to use those options. So we support the rapid rollout of electric and other low or zero emission technologies, which help cut pollution and also stimulate low carbon economies. But these technologies are only as green as their energy source, and if they're coming from a grid which still relies on gas, on fossil fuels, on coal sometimes, they're not the whole solution. The good news is that many of the solutions are within our reach. They're happening already across the country, and they bring other benefits as well, social benefits and economic benefits. So we need an integrated approach to transport and planning. So building cities where homes, jobs are near transport hubs, ensuring that new housing developments support walking and cycling from the very start. So I spoke to someone recently from Liverpool who was saying that brand new roads there had no cycling infrastructure. And there's really no excuse when the brand new roads are going in not to plan in alternatives to cars from the beginning. Reducing the amount of space that's needed for parking makes homes more affordable and allows greater density as well. And the planning system can be used to develop street charging and parking for electric vehicles. And there's some exciting things going on in Sheffield where bike hubs are put into planning, and bike hire is taking off around the country as well. We need to manage demand. So cities only work because not everybody uses a car, otherwise there'd be complete gridlock. And congestion costs the UK economy £11 billion every year. I think there's a real place for rational market mechanisms to make best use of road space. So Nottingham recently introduced the workplace parking levy, and it's early days, but that's looking like it's making real inroads into congestion, into air pollution. And in the longer term, especially given the need to think about government revenue, I think there's the Wolfson Prize recently showed there might be a form of road pricing on the cards for managing demand for our limited roads. We could use this to incentivise more efficient modes to ensure that the polluter paid and people with cleaner transport were prioritised. And I think when you look at demographic trends, millennials are far more likely to be spending their money on technology rather than cars. They're leading the way, and they're promising ways of buying mobility. So rather than buying a car that you own all the time, perhaps buying a mix of car shares or smart tickets or bike hire, and kind of changing that budget mix. So mobility is a service. But I think the big answer to this has to be public transport. You know, it's an old technology. Buses have been on the road a very long time, but the impact is massive. So one bus can take up to 75 cars off the road. We'd like to see more buses retrofitted, so as well as hybrid buses, hydrogen buses, electric buses. Retrofitting the buses are already on our road to bring them up to Euro 6 standard, the highest standard, which is much, much cleaner than the diesel cars on our roads. And I think there's a big role for the government here in rethinking the Bus Service Operators Grant, BSOG, which at the moment is paid out in proportion to the fuel that you burn, which is not a sensible way of going about funding our bus services. And walking and cycling as well. We often talk about the health crisis of air pollution, and indeed there is a health crisis in the air that we're breathing, but there's a second health crisis as well, a health crisis of inactivity, a health crisis of obesity, and so many of us not getting our recommended half an hour of exercise a day, and buses, public transport, active travel can play a big part in reducing inactivity as well. And I think the final point I'd make is about freight, because it isn't just about passenger transport, it's also about making sure that businesses can use rail freight and have that option for getting goods across the country. It's making better use of collection points and low emission vehicles to get around our parcels, our Amazon packages. So, for example, Doodle collection points are springing up at stations everywhere. And I heard recently about a really excellent scheme in Regent Street where they went from having 75 different waste collection companies on their roads down to 2, really rationalising and making best use of the limited road space that they have. So to sum up, I think there's definitely a role for hydrogen vehicles, for electric vehicles, for the exciting new technologies, but we mustn't forget rail, bus, technologies which we've been using for more than a century, but that modal shift is really going to not only clean up our air, but make our cities more attractive and livable places to live, and that investors want to invest in as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Lianna. Lots of great points there, and one important thing we noticed in our report was about the spare capacity that's been opened up in rail transport because of the decline in coal in the country. So we're closing coal power stations by 2025, and a huge chunk of our rail freight is used for transporting coal around the country. So that opens up spare capacity on the rail network. We need to think about inventive ways that we could use this capacity. It doesn't always go to the right places where you might want to move other stuff, but the capacity is there if we can make use of it. I'd like to move on to Hugo Spowers at the end there, who has an interest in hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, and perhaps you could give us an overview of that.
Thank you very much, yes. I'm from RiverSimple. We've been developing hydrogen fuel cell vehicle technology for about 16 years now through a variety of vehicle programs, largely with support from Innovate and its predecessors. We've now got the Rasa, which is our first road legal vehicle built for full type approval. There are two things that I'd like to point out about that. One is that we seem to be the only independent hydrogen fuel cell car company in the world, but we're not betting against the industry. All the OEMs have got hydrogen fuel cell vehicle programs. And in fact, in a KPMG survey earlier this year, 78% of executives around the world thought that fuel cell vehicles were the breakthrough that we need. The second thing is there's a perception that fuel cell technology is a long way off. We're saying it's available here and now, and we're working on putting it into production. We're obviously delighted by all support that goes into ultra-low emission vehicles, and we want to make sure that hydrogen gets its fair shout. We want to make sure that battery and hydrogen refueling infrastructure is developed in parallel, and we have a much healthier competition between the two technologies. There's been an appointment of somebody to represent, guide us through the transition, and that's very good news. But the policy at the moment is driven by the Automotive Council, which has no representation from any company involved in hydrogen. Nissan, Ford, JLR are all on the committee, and they are exclusively fighting for battery electric vehicles. Now, those companies have fuel cell vehicle programs, but not in the UK. And we're in danger, I believe, of being left behind simply because of those the commercial inertia that we face. There are very big, on the infrastructure front, it's always, of course, the thing that people cite with hydrogen vehicles. There are very big differences between the infrastructure challenges, and actually we feel that the challenge is much greater for battery electric vehicles. It's really the killer problem for battery electric vehicles. As they scale, battery electric vehicles become harder and hydrogen vehicles become much easier to refuel. A single hydrogen refueler can support a large number of cars, just like petrol. But if we were to take typical motorway services with 20 petrol pumps, and replace it with Tesla superchargers to support the same throughput of vehicles, we'd need a 14.4 megawatt substation, which, to put in perspective, is the average consumption of 32,000 homes in the UK. So if the idea of changing all our 30 million plus vehicles, plus thousands of filling stations over to batteries, really seems to me to be completely inconceivable. And actually, in the same KPMG survey, 62% of executives felt that the charging infrastructure was the thing that would kill off battery vehicles. The other point about hydrogen infrastructure is that we've got to have a transition strategy, and I feel that it isn't spoken about very much. We do not come into the market with a disruptive technology in the mainstream segments, and that's what we're trying to do. If we want mainstream vehicles supported to create a commercial market, you need hundreds of filling stations. You come into market in a niche where the weaknesses don't matter, and the infrastructure density is the issue. So if we're launching hydrogen vehicles, it only makes sense to launch them at a local level. A single filling station can support a true commercial market rather than a few hundred. That's the critical scale of infrastructure. That prioritizes local use and last mile delivery. It prioritizes cities. It allows you to develop incrementally to develop the nationwide network without ever taking a nationwide gamble. And it, of course, leads to a strong business case for each increment of expansion and much lower level of public sector support. It also prioritizes cities. And that brings us to another big issue that's been referred to, clean air. We're woefully short of meeting targets, as we've seen from the latest round of the Client Earth court cases. And the time has come, really, I believe, where incentives need to be targeted at true ULEVs rather than at interim solutions like hybrids. Another aspect of this that hasn't been talked about at all is that last year there was a peer-reviewed paper came out that explained that some battery electric vehicles are now emitting more particulate matter than diesels. And this is because diesel filters are actually very good. They're much better than the way we deal with NOx. The diesel particulate filters are very good. And so the bulk of emissions come from brakes and tyres. Now, the brake and tyre emissions are proportional to the weight of the car, and battery electric vehicles are heavier, so they emit more particulates than diesel cars. In fact, the Tesla battery weighs more than our entire car. It also leads to a big efficiency problem because efficiency is very tightly linked to weight of cars. And I think the last thing I'd say is endorse what Lianna was saying about mobility as a service. We need fewer cars, but we also need to switch our business model. At the moment, if you look at a VW Beetle from 1948 and 2008, they both did 38 mpg, and less than halfway through that period was the oil crisis. And the honest truth is, if you sell cars, there's no incentive to improve efficiency, because customers will always discount those future costs almost to the point of zero. The only solution then to improving efficiency is regulation. That's a very blunt instrument, as we've seen recently. So probably the single biggest thing we need to change, if we're going to make this step change, is we've got to make efficiency profitable. And that means internalising the life operating costs onto the manufacturer, so that the manufacturer pays for the energy costs of the vehicle, and efficiency truly becomes profitable because the savings go to the manufacturer. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Lots of good points. Again, Hugo, one thing I picked up on that we mentioned in our report was about plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. The emissions from these vehicles depend very much on how you drive them. So I won't embarrass the particular manufacturer, but one of the cars that gets the most money from the government in terms of grants is a large hybrid electric SUV, plug-in hybrid electric. It can do 35 miles on a single charge, which is great. It's very clean for those 35 miles. But if you're going to drive that SUV to Scotland, that's going to be, the emissions are going to be very high driving an SUV that long. So the government needs to think about this and how it incentivizes different vehicles. And also, as we go to ULEVs, it'll have to consider embedded emissions, so the emissions involved in making the vehicle as well. And I'd like to bring in, it's deja vu for myself and Mike, who were sitting here at the Labour conference last week, but I'm very glad he's back again because he has a wealth of knowledge working for Shell across the transport industry. So take it away, Mike.
Morning, everybody. It's Monday. I had a rough journey into Manchester. The traffic was appalling, so let's be gentle with each other and ease ourselves into the week. So there's just a little admin error there. I'm from Shell New Energies. That's a business within Shell that looks at wind, solar, it looks at biofuels and other forms of alternative energies. We know that moving people and goods around is absolutely vital to economic prosperity, and how that is done and how efficiently is really a critical part of the global energy transition that's underway. Now, transport accounts for around a quarter of the world's total energy use and 1/5 of global energy-related emissions for carbon dioxide. So this means that the transport sector has a fundamental role to play in reducing global effort on reducing emissions on a global scale. Now, those three emissions can be separated into three buckets. You've got air quality, you've got carbon dioxide, and you've got noise. So air quality and CO2 are obviously linked, but sometimes it's good to separate them as well to address a specific issue. So I've got three key messages, and because it's Monday and we're being nice to each other, I'm going to give them out and be very clear about them. And the first message is, during the transition to a low-carbon future, different fuels will coexist. So in other words, for goodness sake, please stop backing winners. Winners don't exist. We've spent a long time investigating this, and winners just don't exist. So conventional fuels, e-mobility, hydrogen, biofuels, they're all going to coexist together depending on the sector, because you can use a battery to power a car. It's just not particularly efficient outside of the urban environment. I'm not getting on a battery-powered plane anytime soon. So that's the reality of it. So there's going to be different fuels in the mix. With that in mind, Shell in New Energies, we're developing different solutions for these problems. We've got a very large joint venture called RiverSimple, which is with a company called Copson in Brazil, and that's the world's largest producer of sugarcane ethanol, and that reduces CO2 well-to-wheel by about 70% for gasoline. In Germany, my day job is Hydrogen Business Development Manager, so I'm interested in the hydrogen space, and we're working together as part of another joint venture to really demonstrate that hydrogen is visible in the marketplace, and we're committing to building around 400 retail sites that are available for hydrogen by 2023 in Germany. Now, it would be great if the UK could commit to something similar. We're also looking at e-mobility. We're introducing electric vehicle rapid charging across 10 of our retail sites by the end of this year. The teams are now in the process of installing and testing them, and we're excited to give what that proposition is going to look like as part of our retail offering. And more short term, we've got Shell Gtl Diesel, which stands for gas to liquids, and that's a cleaner diesel made from natural gas that can reduce PM and NOx emissions by 25% in existing diesel engines today. So we have a suite of solutions that can really address noise, air quality, and CO2. But how do we implement all of those? And this is key message number 2. It's collaboration, collaboration, and more collaboration. So it isn't about competing, it's about governments, car and truck manufacturers, and the energy industry working together to bring these new technologies to the marketplace. A good example, there's 2 examples. The first one is H2 Mobility Germany. This is a joint venture that Shell is a part of. There's 6 companies and the German government, so ourselves, Air Liquide, Daimler, Linde, OMV, which is Austrian Oil, and Total. And together we're putting together this nationwide network of hydrogen fuel stations. And at the same time, we're working with Daimler and Toyota to make sure that their vehicles come into those areas where the infrastructure is being rolled out. So there's a chicken and egg problem about infrastructure and cars. Which comes first, the chicken and the egg? Well, actually, in this case, the answer is both. Shell is a founding member of the Hydrogen Council. This is 13 energy, transport and industrial companies with hydrogen investment plans of around $10 billion over the next 5 years. So we're pretty serious about the hydrogen space. And we also opened our first retail site in the UK down at Cobham, just off the M25. And we're opening 2 more, hopefully by the end of this year. That's what our operations guys tell me today. So the 3 key messages are, 1, different fuels will coexist. 2, collaboration is everything. And thirdly, most importantly, there has to be collaboration with governments. A stable and forward-looking and transparent policy framework is essential if everybody is going to invest in the energy future. And that'll do for me, I think.
Thank you very much, Mike. We've had a good overview from our panellists, and we'd like to conclude with Jesse Norman MP to give us the government's view and perhaps your own view as well.
Sure. Well, of course, they're absolutely the same, Matthew. As you know, we operate in a strict, no deviation from agreed policy. No. Thank you very much indeed for having me along today, and thanks everyone for coming to listen to this event. It's a delight to be back at Policy Exchange. As you will know, I'm a former executive director of this fine institution, and so I know how much we all value the support that Anglo-American and others have given to this programme, and the support you show by coming along, so thank you for that. I'm a road user myself, as you may know. I drive a car. I'm a very keen cyclist. I bicycle to work back and forth every day, and have done all my life, more or less. I walk. I take the bus. All that stuff. So I have a kind of wide view of how people use roads and how people think about, and I feel exposed to many of the air quality issues when I'm sitting behind, an old-fashioned diesel truck or something in the streets of London on my bicycle and ducking for cover. Now, what are we doing in government? I think the first thing to do is talk about the kind of principles that we're adopting and then look at where that goes in terms of policy. So you will be aware the overwhelming goal in this area for us as a government is to improve air quality, and it has historically been to do that as part of a process of decarbonising the economy in general. And when I was Minister for Energy, of course, spent a lot of time thinking about the different methods of decarbonisation. And as you know, there are some parts of the economy that are easier to decarbonise, and other power has been a very important part of our decarbonisation strategy. Transport remains a very difficult nut to crack, and I think everyone recognises that. And within that overall approach, improving air quality, and as has been mentioned, there's a certain amount of legal pressure to do that, but actually, I think what people forget is that our air quality has been improving dramatically over the past, decade or two, and it's going to continue to improve. And as it improves, so we rightly, as consumers and citizens, become fussier about what it is we want it to improve in different ways, and the legal challenges that come with that, and I entirely respect and admire that process. So that's the overwhelming environment. Within that, I'd stress, I think, two other factors. One is tech neutrality. So we do try to strike a kind of balance between being progressive in our support for new technologies, but not, as it were, discriminatory in a way that prevents new flowers from arising and prevents new technologies from arising. And that's an important principle, and it applies not just to the vehicles that travel on our roads, but also the charging infrastructure that goes with them, and also, it's not just about cars, of course, it's also about the overall transport mix. And Lianna is exactly right, how you bring in walking and cycling, and how you bring in buses and the better use of our public infrastructure. Public transport is a very important part of that. And the final theme, I'd say, is it's really important for all parts of government to do their job. And that's not just, I tend to speak for English transport for reasons of devolution, but exactly the same kinds of considerations apply obviously in Scotland and in Wales. It's really heartening and exciting to see that the new mayors are taking on the mandate of improving transport from an air quality standpoint, as well as from a convenience and utilisation standpoint. I think it's fantastic. So what are we actually doing? Well, let's just go to some specific policies. So obviously, you will be aware, in the context of air quality, we have a joint responsibility on this in my department with DEFRA, and we've made a lot of announcements over the summer about air quality. I'm sure you've seen those, and we will be moving towards specific clean air zones in particular areas of the country. And we are appealing to that last principle I've mentioned to you when I opened up my earlier remarks, which is we're expecting local government to play a very significant role in that, because every area has different specific issues, and we've put aside significant amounts of money to help with that transition, to help them to deal with the issues that they've got. So clean air zones are a very important part of that. We're very supportive, and we have been very supportive of the big car companies' scrappage schemes. We'd like to see those extended and continued. You know, I like them to include Euro 5 vehicles if the economics can ever be made to work for that. So I think that's another important part. We spend a lot of money subsidising the purchase of electric vehicles, subsidising transport infrastructure in electricity, and a certain amount in hydrogen as well. And I'm very much looking to, continue to work with the industry in both cases to make that happen and to roll that out further. I do think I sat down the other day with the car companies to talk about how that could be done for our charging infrastructure, which again we're trying to maintain a neutral base so that different charging companies can compete with each other in a way that benefits the customer. But I like to have exactly the same conversation with suppliers or utilisers of hydrogen infrastructure, so that we can have that further conversation about maintaining neutrality between those two sides. We have, as you know, an Office of Low Emission Vehicles, which is designed to coordinate a lot of this stuff across government, which is a very unusual development actually in government. Very few places around the world have taken these issues with as much seriousness as to set up an office across government for that, and we need to do more with that. And I also want to pick up some of the other themes that were mentioned by colleagues across the panel in thinking about that. And one that comes up very closely and related to something that Lianna said earlier was not just the creation of new infrastructure, but enforcement of a proper neutrality between different ways of using that infrastructure. And we certainly have, we have laws in place that are designed to require, as part of the planning processes for new roads, that there be adequate provision for cycling and walking. And if that isn't happening, then we need better enforcement of it and better processes of building that into the planning and development process up front. And that's something I'm already have underway with Highways England, but it'd be very good to push it further within local government. What else? So retrofitting buses, that's a very important thing. We support that. Let me just pick up a couple of two or three sort of subordinate themes that people have raised then in closing. So the first one was one raised by Lianna, fewer cars. I'm not absolutely persuaded at the moment that should be a goal of government, not because I want to see fewer cars or more cars, but because who knows how people are going to be using the infrastructure we have. And if it can be done cleanly, I'm not sure we should be in the government, should be in the business of deciding what the absolute number of cars should be, or whether it's attractive to make it larger or smaller. We may well get to a situation in 30 or 40 years' time where people get into their car, it's an autonomous vehicle, they get out of it 3 hours later, and they're in north of Birmingham and probably in Manchester or near to, and they've worked all the way through. Now that implies a transport shift in modality and the way in which we use cars, which is unimaginable at the moment, and brings them much closer to the way in which we use trains. And it may be that that's a wise thing to do, but I'm not sure at this point I want to make an ex-ante pronouncement on it or anything like that. Business operations operators grant, a bus operators grant, I absolutely think we're looking at reorganising at that. I think that's a point well made. I think making efficiency profitable. Hugo raised a whole series of really interesting in-principle issues, which I'd love to discuss. I mean, we have a situation at the moment in many industries, and this applies in the automotive industry and the ancillary industries around cars and transport, where these are still externality generators in economic terms. What happens when you force those institutions over time to price all of their costs into their vehicles is a very, very multi tens of billions of pounds economic question. And we're getting better at it, and we're getting better at it in terms of industry as a whole, and we're getting better at it in terms of car industry. But it does imply a dramatic shift in the way the economics of the car business works, and that can only be of interest and potential value to consumers. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jesse. The one thing, you covered a lot there, but the one thing that I picked up on that's very important, it's particularly difficult for transport, is that almost every department across government and the devolved administrations and the mayors all have some sort of interest in transport. So how each of those parts of government interacts with one another is one of the most important parts of transport policy. I've got about 25 minutes left. We're going to go to the floor. Something I should have said at the start, we are being live streamed on Facebook, and this will go up on the Policy Exchange website. So it would be horrible if any of you were to misspeak or to make a faux pas live on Facebook. I don't.
As when you thanked everyone, said you'd like to spank everyone.
Well, yes. And I'll start at the front here. Can I have name, organisation, yes, and wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. My name is Brett from the Builders Merchants Federation. The 600 companies that I speak for have no choice but to use diesel by the very nature of our last mile deliveries of steel girders and glass and bricks and so on. We don't have a choice. So my question to the panel is, do you recognise my predicament and how can you help me? But in reverse, my plea to you is that if you want to go further, and Jesse is a former energy minister, as you said, is that we also have some of the solutions. If you want to do something on home heating, boilers and burners, I'm your man. And if you want to go further into buildings, I'm not supposed to tell you, but I've got companies inventing paint for external buildings that will absorb NOx. I've got companies doing roofing materials which will absorb NOx. So that's my predicament. How can you help me? We can't have any other vehicle fuel than diesel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I know that Shell have a diesel replacement. Is that relevant to?
It's a good point you raise, and I think this is where the collaboration piece is really important, because if you look at the maturity of hydrogen within the heavy-duty sector, it's not that mature. So I think it's actually down to customers to be asking the OEMs, when is the next generation of diesel and hydrogen vehicle coming through? If that message gets back to us, I mean, of course, one of my commitments when I'm rolling out hydrogen infrastructure is that it's fit for purpose for both light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles. But that's a few years down the road, because, of course, we have to work with the OEMs to get to that point. There are solutions in place. I mean, obviously, we've spoken about retrofitting for some of the existing vehicles. We do have a product called gas to liquids, which helps reduce PM and NOx right now, and it's compatible with all diesel engines. But it's about choice as well. So I think you do have to look at the suite of solutions that are ahead of you and make a choice of what you're doing in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And that's actually quite difficult for any organisation to predict, because my crystal ball's a bit cloudy as well. So that's why we need to talk to one another a bit more to make sure that the implementation plan is actually firm and committed to by government as well as in the private sector. So I know it's a bit of a woolly answer, but there are options out there. Please come and talk to us and other energy providers for solutions that are there.
Jess, you'd like to comment? Or?
Well, no, I mean, I would say, that's very interesting, and I absolutely recognise the point you're making. I'd be very interested, and I'm sure colleagues would be interested, to think of ways in which you can help us to decarbonise houses. That's another very big issue of government policy and homes. On the issue of the last mile, we absolutely recognise that. If you look at the way in which the glide path has been constructed for the phasing out of fossil fuels, it is specifically designed to allow a certainty of what the end point is, which gives people an incentive to make improvements of the kind that Hugo has been describing are not being made. But it also is designed to allow people to innovate in a way that would reduce the burden imposed by diesels before then. So it's that balance that we're trying to get.
Thank you. There are questions at the far side there. I'll go to this gentleman on the side.
Hi, Stuart Easterbrook from Cadence. We operate 4 of the gas distribution networks in the UK, and I think your report shows that using natural gas is an option for fast deployment. It can be deployed at scale. It deals with air quality, and if you put renewable gases through the network, it can also deal with low carbon. So we go out and talk to stakeholders to try and encourage them to use the gas network that's already there. And one of the sort of the feedback we get is that there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, it's not about picking winners. What they're worried about is investing money and picking losers. we need to do things quickly. We need to find options that are going to stop. We are killing hundreds of people, hundreds and thousands of people. We need to do things that can make a difference very, very quickly. What does the panel think are the best options to try to do things at scale quickly?
Would anyone? Hugo, would you like to come in on that?
Well, we are definitely looking at endgame solutions, and we're not in that. There's a lot of interim things that can be done and that are being done, and they're all beneficial. We're focused on the endgame solutions that do have the potential to be sustainable in the long run, because from our point of view, being less unsustainable is still not sustainable. We have to have a clear vision for that. And so there are other things that other people are doing which are complementary to what we're doing, but we're not in that game. We don't have a solution for the last mile delivery for heavy girders. We do have a solution for the last mile delivery of Amazon packets, where you have vehicles with a 1-ton payload that rarely carry over 100 kilos. And so we're going to be introducing a vehicle to fill that market segment. And it again uses a local infrastructure strategy, so it's something that can be done here and now. But we do urgently plead for people to be investing predominantly in solutions that have the potential to have to ultimately be sustainable, rather than be another dead end that is going to make something a little bit less bad but still not solve a problem. And hybrid vehicles, I'm afraid, is one that is now established in the marketplace. They're commercially viable, they're great, but I don't believe that we should be financing those interim solutions further.
Yeah. And Lianna, I was going to say that getting people on public transport is a way to make big wins quickly if you can incentivize them to do it.
Absolutely. And something that makes me very excited is the rapid change we're having towards more city devolution. So, Transport for Greater Manchester right here, right now. And the government last year brought in the Bus Services Act, which gives unprecedented powers, not only for city mayors, but for local authorities in rural areas as well as in urban areas, to really plan their bus services and link up the planning of bus networks with the way that housing developments are planned, with the big employers in their area, with infrastructure. I would look at the island of Jersey, which introduced bus franchising in 2013, and in just 3 years increased bus patronage by a third. So really speeding up the flows on their roads and making sure the road space was available for essential road users, not just people sitting and idling in traffic. So I think I'm looking towards the cities for that kind of rapid action towards cleaner, more attractive transport.
Yeah, thank you. We had a question on the end there, just caught my eye, and we'll try to get as many in as possible before they... Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Laura Shaw from Transport for the West Midlands. So we are a mayoral-led combined authority with the mayor who's quite passionate about air quality. And my question is sort of one back to the panel, which is we want to be a city region that leads on innovation and different types of technology. But one of the challenges for us is what can we do as local government to encourage that innovation and that infrastructure in our city regions? Because that bit is still a little bit unclear to me. It comes back to not picking a winner, but actually how do we create those conditions for all of them to thrive?
I think that's probably a perfect one for the Minister for Local
Well,
Transport.
I think let me just start by saying I think that, well, as you and I have discussed, Laura, what Andy Street is trying to do in Birmingham is potentially extremely exciting, and the same is true of other cities where we've seen recently elected mayors. These are, ambitious individuals invariably who have got very strong visions for how they want to see their local area changed, and they also have a remit of which transport is an absolutely central part, and they get held to account. They know they're going to be held to account by that. And one of the things that's really interesting is how the Bus Franchising Act that we passed actually earlier this year has already started to be used by local government to incentivize different behaviours without actually necessarily creating new franchises or reallocating them. Just the possibility of doing that has already created greater engagement between the bus companies and the mayoralties, which is great. Now, you asked a question about city regions. It's a very, very difficult question. You have parts of the country in which city regions are by no means aligned with the cities of which they are the regions. I think I'll leave that there. We know that that's true, so it's not by any means a uniform picture. And you have a historic issue, which has just been the case for 400 years, that cities have tended to be the generators of economic wealth and therefore innovation and change. So inevitably, you're going to have a tension between the regions which feel left behind, but which actually are fundamental to the effective development of cities, which are increasingly pricing themselves from a labour and employment standpoint in their very centres out of being competitive. And that implies a different dynamic. Now, how you crack that is going to be different in each case, but you're going to have to find some way, and we do within central government try to find ways of encouraging a non-oppressive, balanced set of conversations that can bring people to the table and allow development to flow consensually rather than, as it were, by government diktat. But I don't think it's easy at all, and I think it really depends on the particular character and the energies of the people involved. And one of the things I will say, it's actually interesting, is the West Midlands engine is giving, certainly from a central government standpoint, gives me a very good feeling about the way it's developing. And as a Herefordian MP, I can see that. Herefordshire is very interested to be part of those conversations, and we need it from the point of view of all different aspects of our infrastructure.
Thank you. Would anyone else? We'll take a question here at the front and then one in behind.
Hi there, I'm Charlie Hamilton. I work for Tower Transit, and we run and own hydrogen vehicles in London. So I'm a big fan of hydrogen. But I completely agree with Hugo on your views on electric that you mentioned earlier. 2 points and then one very quick question, if I can. The retrofitting points that you made is much harder for local authorities. Our business in London gets support from the mayor and TfL, whereas my business in Cambridge that I run, I have to apply for the Greener Energy Fund through the local authority. I can't make the application myself to retrofit vehicles, so there's no guarantee that I can get any funding for my sort of 100+ buses up in Cambridgeshire. I'm also running autonomous trials in London, and I expect to have autonomous demand-responsive cars in London by Q3 2019. So my question to the panel is, how do you see autonomous demand-responsive vehicles shifting people out of their cars and integrating that mode with the public transport system? And for you, Jesse, do you think the regulation will be able to keep up with the technology? Because at the moment, the regulation is somewhat lagging, and America and Silicon Valley the regulation is much more advanced than it is over here in the UK.
Thank you. I'll let Andy answer that point and then maybe go to Lianna on the public transport question. Jess?
Oh, sorry, I was sorry, I misunderstood what you said. So I'll take the last point then. It's often the case that government struggles to stay up with changes in technology, and actually, in many ways, that's not a bad thing. Sometimes these technology changes tend to be fits and starts rather than steady developments. So, but it's not made easier by the fact that we inherit a structure of checks and balances in our evolved system of government, which can make it very hard for local players. I don't need to tell you this, but if you are operating in London, not an area for which I have any responsibility, I might add. A, it isn't an area for which I have any responsibility. B, even the case of TfL, it's an area where if you want to run local licenses, you've got to get those from the boroughs. And that creates a very difficult situation because, and again, I'm interested to have you feed into the audience later at some point after this, but I have seen situations where people have got several boroughs lined up, and then they get progressively held to ransom by their marginal boroughs, which they need to hit critical mass. Now, how you solve that problem is a really serious issue of coordination local government. Our commitment from a public standpoint is to try to be sufficiently close to the technologies that are clearly sticking to allow that marketplace to start to flourish. And there tends to be a gap between the initial innovation, where enlightened authorities find some way to make that happen to get the spark going, and then the rollout, which requires, as it were, detailed decisions in principle about how it's going to be managed. And in that gap, good government can play its role.
Lianna?
I think it's a very good point, well made, about the making it easier for bus manufacturers to access retrofitting. Retrofitting a bus to Euro 6 standards costs about £13,000, which is much more bang for your buck in terms of air pollution than retrofitting cars. So I'd like to see that process streamlined so you don't have to be in London to be able to apply directly as an operator. And one way in which I think the government can really help keep up with the rapid changes in technology for vehicles is for mobility vouchers. So when people decide to scrap a car, rather than just getting a new car and replacing it with a greener, cleaner car, giving people the option of a mobility voucher where they can spend that in different ways. So that might be an electric bike, an electric cargo bike, that might be a bus season ticket, it might be a train season ticket, it might be car hire, it might be any mixture of those. So you're leaving it up for individuals who live in different places with different needs to then invest indirectly in the vehicle technologies that work best for them.
Thank you. Who do we have? Could we have one? I promised the question in the middle there. We'll take two together, one here and one down at the front, the right-hand side.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ken Pollock, Worcestershire County Council. Sorry, have I...
No, go ahead. You go first and we'll...
Yeah, with the microphone. I wonder whether I could get the panel to comment on the recent DEFRA announcement about the future of petrol and diesel cars post-2040, because it's wisely interpreted as meaning that we won't have any such vehicles. But I have the statement in front of me here, and it says we move towards 2040, by which point the government will end the sale of all new conventional petrol and diesel cars and vans. Okay? This shift will resolve our air quality problem as combustion engines, blah, 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 from our towns and cities. Because air quality is fundamentally a problem of towns and cities. And that word conventional clearly leaves open the possibility of continuing sales of petrol and diesel vehicles beyond 2040 if they're hybrids. Now, nobody seems to have picked up on that. Everybody said, oh, we're going to end petrol and diesel vehicles altogether. Though that word conventional seems to be rather crucial, and I wonder whether the panel might comment.
Thank you. We'll take this one as well.
Yes, my question is also to do with the air quality plan that was published in the summer, in July. And we heard Jesse refer to clean air zones coming forward. Many people who want to clean up the air quickly are a bit disappointed in that your own modelling shows very clearly that charging clean air zones are the best way to get within the legal limits. But at the same time, understandably, the government's wary of charging people who especially have been incentivised to take up diesel cars over the last 20 or so years. So I wanted to ask the panel, coming from a technology standpoint, I'm working with a company called Tantalum, which is developing technology to do real-time emissions estimation as you're driving around. So we're not talking about what the OEMs tell you, we're talking about reality, working with Imperial College to deliver that. And it could help to deliver the charging clean air zones in a much fairer way. So instead of having a blanket charge, you actually pay as you pay for what the environmental impact you actually do as you drive around. And we think that's a much fairer way and an easier sell perhaps to some of the stakeholders of White Van Man who be understandably upset because diesel is the only technology at the moment that's economically advisable.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's one of the most important things we picked up on as well, is that the measurement systems for measuring NOx and even for CO2 are currently inadequate, so we need to improve that. Hugo, you talked about not focusing on hybrids and going straight into ULEVs, so maybe you'd like to take up on.
Well, I agree with what Mike said earlier, that we need a much more complex mix of fuels and powertrains than we've had in the past. And despite my pointed comments about battery vehicles, I do believe that they have a role. Their characteristics are so different to those of hydrogen vehicles, they shouldn't be doing the same thing. And it is short-range applications. And by the same token, as I say, we don't have a solution for delivery of heavy goods at the moment. And there will be areas in which combustion engines carry on for longer. Coming to those hybrids, I do believe one thing that is inevitably going to happen is energy costs are going to rise. They're going to have to rise if we do any sensible full cost accounting in society. And in that case, for passenger vehicles, I simply don't see combustion engines being competitive, whether they're hybrid or not. So our vehicle, for instance, at the moment does the energy equivalent of 250 mpg. And there's no hybrid technology or combustion engine-based technology that can ever approach that. So I'd like to think it's a slightly academic point. In the mainstream personal vehicle area, segments, I don't believe that they're going to have a role.
If I may, I think this is a complicated problem. The real world emissions question is something that's been on our minds for quite a while, and you actually have to look at every single solution that you can take on board. So whether that's a different fuel, whether that's a different way of driving, whether that's different traffic light sequencing, all of those things add up to tangible solutions. And also as well, I challenge the statement that air quality is just a towns and cities problem. We're seeing it on motorways as well. So the air quality just past outside of motorways, where a lot of houses are being built, is now also looking pretty bad. So I think you really have to take an end-to-end view, not focus in on one thing and look holistically across. An example of that was I was working with Edinburgh, and they were interested in reducing their emissions from bus fleets. And we engaged with our commercial fleet around telematics, and they managed to reduce their fuel consumption by 15% just by changing driver habits. Now, that's quite a significant gain for actually not very much investment. Now, the challenge there is once you train these people is to get them to maintain it. Then you have a look at your other solutions as well. So it really is an end-to-end picture that needs to be taken into account.
And drop solutions can be hard.
Indeed, yeah.
Sure. Any quick point, Jesse, before we take the last questions?
Where to begin? So the real emissions point is a point about the internalisation of costs, in part. So I think, and it's also a very interesting example of how technologies can be employed within the vehicle, and therefore, in a funny way, you want to allow, the function of government is to allow the recognition of those costs, allow people to change their behaviour accordingly, in a way. Very quickly, other thing, I'm very surprised to hear Hugo opine so trenchantly on the direction of energy costs. I remember taking a non-trivial amount of money in the form of beer off one of my constituents who was a Green, who confidently predicted that oil prices were going to go up when they were $100 a barrel. When they got to 50, I suggested he might pay up. In a world in which electricity being generated from renewables is becoming endemic at low cost, it's not by any means obvious that energy costs will go up. Maybe they will, we don't know.
Yeah. I don't want Greenpeace to think I'm ignoring them, so I'll take one from Doug, and then one at the front here. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Matt. It's Doug Parr from Greenpeace. Question to the Minister, because I was surprised just today to find out that even in London there's only one rapid charger for taxi services, which are going to have to become emissions capable. And it feels to me like even in the immediate assistance that electric vehicles can provide in sorting out our air quality problem, charging infrastructure might be falling behind. And to get charging infrastructure right requires a whole range of actors to come together, including local government, including the people who are installing, the DNOs, distribution network operating companies. I'm sure you're aware as a former energy minister, of course. And I was just wondering what you could say about the role that government is taking, not in imposing the solution, but actually trying to drive forward and using convening power to make sure this happens, because there is money available through OLEV. But actually sorting out some of this nitty-gritty is the sort of thing that could easily just sort of drift. And if we're going to take advantage of it, like that fantastic new electric taxi factory up in Coventry, making the UK a good place to do this needs, some proper drive from government, it feels.
Okay, thanks. We'll take the last question here, and we'll let the panellists respond.
We haven't talked much about...
Sorry, name and organisation.
Bruce Buckland, I'm an architect and regular cyclist.
Okay.
We haven't talked much about
a real
cycling.
person.
A real person.
Welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about cycling, and that's getting people out of cars and onto bikes is a great way to clean up road transport. In big cities like London, it's kind of a sort of self-reinforcing prophecy. But what is the government doing in terms of smaller towns and cities to ensure that expansive and contiguous cycle networks are put in place and are taken up by local users?
Okay, thank you. We have to wrap up soon, so I'll let Jesse respond to those questions and then we'll finish up.
So very quickly, on charging infrastructure, a point made by General Greenpeace, look, we're doing a lot already, and there's a lot already in progress, and the interesting thing about the taxi companies is that that's a precise example of setting a marker in the ground and then, as it were, using that to leverage in a lot of new investment, which I think will take place. The other thing I would say is that, of course, there are multiple different charging methodologies and charging approaches, and part of the technique there is to allow, you know, the situation to kind of equilibrate itself. So it's certainly true that we need to keep an eye on it, and it needs to be continuously pushed. But we very much need private investment to flow as well. And it kind of goes to the point also was raised by Bruce here. The way our cycling and walking strategy, which is, you know, we now have a cycling and walking strategy. We didn't have that before. It's a very good thing. It's got a lot of money attached to it. But the money attached to it has tended to flow through a whole variety of different strands, through some national organisations and through a lot of local government. The trouble with that is that actually it takes away from central government one of the tools of the convener power that allows one to say, actually, do you know what, we really need to be linking up this, you know, maybe a city and its city region or a set of rural networks together better. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to see if we can unlock that a little bit and get some more capability for government. We always hear about, you know, the importance of the leading role played by countries in Holland and Scandinavian places in this area, and there is no magic solution to that problem. The solution is to start now and to do a lot, and then do a lot more, and then keep doing a lot. In 30, 40 years' time, it'll be all beautiful.
Thank you very much, Jesse. It's been a fantastic debate. Thank you all much for coming. I'd like to once again thank our sponsors, Anglo American, who have a leaflet on your chairs on hydrogen and battery electric vehicles. I'd like to thank our events team, and again, on your chairs, you have a leaflet showing all of the wonderful events the Policy Exchange are doing, both here and in our event space outside the secure zone. And I'd like you to join us in thanking the panelists.